Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, is a video game of contradictions. Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, is a video game that makes you feel clever or foolish in equal measure. Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, is a video game that's barely even a video game. Releasing in Japan as Gyakuten Saiban Yomigairu Gyakuten for the Nintendo Game Boy Advance on October 12, 2001, before releasing again worldwide for the Nintendo DS between September 2005 and March 2006, before releasing again bundled together as a trilogy for the Nintendo 3DS in 2014, before releasing again for the Nintendo Switch in 2019, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney has been around the block a few times. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney does the impossible. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney makes lawyering fun, ingeniously combining two distinct modes of gameplay, the investigations and the court battles. Much like the proverbial scales of justice balances both sides of an argument, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney leads us to an ultimate conclusion, a realization, a revelation, the absolute truth of the matter. That fundamental truth being that this series rules. Of course, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney didn't just spawn in a vacuum, and is in fact a product of decades of evolution within Japanese media. Over the course of this review, I'll be examining just where a game like Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney came from, what sets it apart as such a unique experience, and how it stands as an interactive addition to the murder mystery genre. With all that said, don your deerstalkers, curl your mustaches and pop on your favourite crumpled raincoat, because there's been a murder most foul, see? Who doesn't love a good murder mystery? Of course, murder mysteries as a literary concept have existed for a long old time, from far before those first few copies of Gyakuten Saiban hit Japanese shelves in 2001. The first murder mystery as we now view them was penned by American author Edgar Allan Poe in 1841, entitled The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Now, I've not read The Murders in the Rue Morgue, but at the very least, if you have got to murder someone, the morgue seems like a particularly convenient place to do so. Following this, of course, we all know the classics in some shape or form, the works of Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie demonstrating something of a British monopoly on the genre for quite some time there, but that really isn't the whole picture. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, another rather famous little island was experiencing something of a literary renaissance. In 1923, a Japanese author called Taro Hirai published a novel entitled Nisen Doka, or The 2-Sen Copper Coin, a work lauded at the time for its very logical deductive reasoning used to explain its murder within. As a quick aside, I just want to point out that Taro Hirai wrote under the pen name Edogawa Ranpo, which you may notice sounds quite a lot like a Japanification of the name Edgar Allan Poe. That was intentional on the author's part, and I don't know man, I thought that was pretty funny. In penning this first work, this first proper Japanese foray into the murder mystery genre, it got the ball rolling for many different authors to follow. At this point, over a century later, the Japanese murder mystery genre is both rich and expansive, featuring many prolific authors like Seishi Yokomitsu, Akimitsu Takagi, Saicho Matsumoto, and Yukito Ayatsuji, whose novels following murders always being committed in the various creative, bizarre, and deranged works of the in-universe architect Nakamura Seiji are a particular favourite of mine. This particular genre of novel has its own name, Honkaku. Translated into English as orthodox, Honkaku is the genre of logical Japanese murder mysteries in which all the clues are presented to the reader throughout the story. No cheeky last-minute rug pulls or cheap surprises. The Honkaku novel I'm currently reading, entitled Tokyo Express by the aforementioned Seicho Matsumoto, hinges a pretty major plot point on studying and identifying a crucial 4-minute gap in a train's timetable where a particular platform is empty. Which is like a murder mystery plot that could never take place in the UK. In the words of the Honkaku author Shimada Soji, these works are not only literature, but to a greater or lesser extent, a game. So, you know, who's to say there can't be a video game too, right? But if you want to turn a murder mystery into a video game, a genre so entrenched in the medium of the novel, how on earth do you do that? That's easy, you just make a visual novel. On that note, did you know that the first visual novel was Japanese? Did you also know that the first visual novel was a murder mystery? Did you also know that the first visual novel, entitled Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken, or the Portopia Serial Murder Case, was created in 1983 for the Famicom by none other than video game industry legend, Dragon Quest daddy and serial indoor sunglasses enjoyer Yuji Horii. To understand Phoenix Wright's roots, it's vital to acknowledge the genius of the Portopia Serial Murder Case, a fantastic Honkaku story in its own right. As part of my research for this review, I watched a full playthrough of the game on YouTube via the Nenriki Gaming channel, who had very helpfully recorded an English translation of the game, and I'm chuffed to say that I actually called whodunit in advance, because the hints were most certainly there. The game was fair, with a neat twist reminiscent of Akimitsu Takagi's Normin Satsujin Jiken, or the Normask murder. I won't spoil it. It's not a particularly long game at all if you know what you're doing. The full playthrough I watched lasted all of 25 minutes, but it's very clear to see just how much of an influence a game like the Portopia Serial Murder Case had on games moving forwards, like Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. Several staples of the Ace Attorney series are right here, namely the first-person perspective at various scenes, the option to move between different screens or locations, as well as the literal investigate button, which brings up a magnifying glass cursor from which you select different items of interest on the screen. More on that later. Focusing finally now on visual novels in general for the moment, they've of course gone from strength to strength as a genre over the years, particularly in Japan, but also more recently abroad too. Whilst the collective Western world may have rolled their eyes and scoffed at those crazy Japanese for games like Konami's long-running dating sim Tokimeki Memoriaru back in 1994, releasing the same year that I did, these days games like Steins Gate and even Doki Doki Literature Club have allowed an almost mainstream stay into popular culture. Of course, the best-selling visual novel series of all time is none other than Danganronpa. Objection! Let me just check my notes. My bad. I was looking at an outdated sales report. Turns out the most popular visual novel series of all time is none other than Ace Attorney, with over 11 million lifetime sales. So, what is it about Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney that's made it so successful? What has made it stand head and shoulders above its fellow visual novel peers? Let's take a look. There's a lot to be said about what kind of visual novel Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney is, or in other words, what kind of story it's trying to tell. If you even have a passing interest in Phoenix Wright, you may be aware of the notion that it's supposed to be a biting satire, a parody of the Japanese legal system, and honestly it's pretty easy to see where such comparisons come from. Getting the headline figure out of the way, Japanese courts have an utterly staggering 99% conviction rate. On its own, that's a pretty damning figure. It's easy to see why Ace Attorney features a legal system which is hilariously biased towards the prosecution, often featuring them unilaterally determine the procedures of the court, even within this first game. However, J. Mark Ramsayer and Eric B. Rasmussen of Harvard Law School offer something of a rebuttal, saying, "We suggest an alternative explanation. The high conviction rates reflect case selection and low prosecutorial budgets. Understaffed prosecutors present judges with only the most obviously guilty defendants." Indeed, the counter-argument to the idea that everyone is found guilty is that the defendants who ever end up in front of the court were almost certainly guilty to begin with more ambiguous cases factored out. This is hardly a bulletproof case for saying that there's never been a single miscarriage of justice in Japan, yet it could go some way towards making that 99% figure make a little bit more sense. However, on the other hand, there's literally a very sobering Human Rights Watch article about Japan's hostage justice system, or Hitojichi Shiho, which paints a much bleaker picture. It tells of suspects being detained for months and years at a time to extract a confession, legitimate or not. Suddenly the idea that the Ace Attorney series is a critique of this horrible system has a lot more credence again. The tricky thing is, Ace Attorney series creator Shu Takumi, to my knowledge, has never explicitly confirmed this one way or the other. In fact, in an interview with Capcom USA in 2019, he said, "When I had set out to write the first game's script, I had wanted to make it something people could play in 10 years' time and still feel that it was as relevant then as when I'd written it. Therefore, I avoided things that would date it, like using popular slang phrases or building stories around current affairs, and instead focused on stories that anyone can easily relate to and understand." The use of current affairs there is pretty telling. There's no doubt that every artist, when expressing their artistry, be it through the pen, the paintbrush, the keyboard, is influenced by their environment, which is something I touched upon briefly in my Yakuza 0 video. I have no doubt that Shu Takumi was aware of the fault of the Japanese legal system at the time, though I do wonder if he was consciously trying to avoid dwelling on it. Indeed, he went on to say, "The point of the game wasn't the law or even reality. Instead, I imagined a game where the point was to have fun solving puzzles and to enjoy the excitement of calling witnesses out in their lives with evidence. I imagined the courtroom to be like a huge coliseum where the crowds above would loudly cheer on the verbal gladiators below." Of course, the actual Japanese legal system isn't actually on trial here, whilst Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney's story is. Indeed, I would argue, Your Honour, that the primary theme of Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney is not its inherent critical broadsides against a deeply flawed Japanese legal system, but in fact about that age-old trope, the power of friendship. Ace Attorney is a tale of friends separated and reunited, a tale of reconciliation. This bromantic tale in fact takes the form of a friendship triangle. Phoenix Wright and Miles Edgeworth representing the more acute angles, whereas Larry Butts here is just obtuse. We all know a Larry. We all have a Larry in our respective friendship circles. If you happen to be watching this and thinking to yourself that you don't know a Larry, then I have some news for you. I'm mentioning Larry first, not only because he's a particularly easy target, but because he's your first client. Columbo style, Ace Attorney's first case, its tutorial turnabout, immediately reveals to the player who committed the crime, taking the deductive pressure off and allowing you to focus entirely on taking your target down. Edgeworth remains elusive in this first case, but Larry is introduced immediately, revealed to be a childhood friend of Phoenix very early on. Larry is brought in a man accused, a man charged with the murder of his recently estranged girlfriend, Cindy Stone. I'll be going into the 5 individual cases in more detail during the penultimate section of this review, but naturally due to the opening cutscene of the game, we know immediately without brandishing even the smallest magnifying glass that Larry is innocent, even though when something smells it's usually the butts. Miles Edgeworth, however, is a much more complicated character, the yin to Phoenix Wright's yang, the immovable object to his unstoppable force, the Morecambe to his wise. Edgeworth is very much a man preceded by his reputation, and a particularly unpleasant one at that. Accusations of forging evidence, intimidating witnesses, all the kind of things the real Japanese legal system gets accused of, all in the name of getting that precious guilty verdict, every single time. Phoenix doesn't make much of a secret of his history with Edgeworth, but to Miles they're perfect strangers upon their first encounter within this legal coliseum, in which Phoenix himself finds himself at the mercy of this bearded, befuddled Caesar, desperately trying to bluff himself out of that fatal thumbs down. This is in fact a friendship in need of rebooting, not just developing. As to how this happens will become apparent in a later section of this review, in which we'll focus on the actual minutiae of each case. Keeping things more general for the time being, one area which unsurprisingly is critical to making a good visual novel is the actual quality of the writing. Whilst I can't speak for the original Japanese text, what I can say with absolute certainty is that the English script is fantastic. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney features no voice acting, besides, of course, objection! And the like, but each character is still distinctive, from Larry's earnest eccentricities to Edgeworth's stern sullenness to Mia's gentle guidance. The writing is clever, witty and sharp. Much like its paper-based Honkaku counterparts, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney cleverly scatters its clues throughout its prose, through its copious amounts of dialogue or buried in the ever-expanding court record. Ace Attorney is a series that requires you to actually pay attention, lest you wind up utterly embarrassing yourself in front of the judge and getting your poor client that ever ominous guilty verdict. Of course, one major twist on the usual honkaku formula that Phoenix Wright employs comes in the form of Maya Fey. I'm talking about spirit channeling. This functions as more of an actual mechanic over just a narrative device in later games, but it's introduced here, early into the opening chapters of the second case. Basically, Maya Fey is a spirit medium in training, with the occasional ability to channel her hyper-competent and somewhat dead older sister Mia Fey, usually in clutch moments to carry Phoenix Wright through particularly tricky situations to save the day. I'll be honest, and this may well be controversial, I'm not particularly sure as to how I feel about the whole spirit channeling thing. I have no objections to Maya as a character whatsoever. Holmes had Watson, Poirot had Hastings, Phoenix has Maya, yet I do wonder how much would have been truly lost on a case-by-case basis if Phoenix wasn't able to summon a get-out-of-jail-free card whenever things got particularly dicey. Granted, some very cool stuff in later games revolve around these themes and the Fey family, but I've never been particularly taken in by it, preferring the forensic-focused activities of Emma Skye, which, granted, didn't strictly appear in the series until the 4th mainline entry before being retrofitted into the DS port of Gyakutan Saiban. Finally, let's talk about Phoenix Wright himself. As far as protagonists go, Phoenix Wright is far from silent, which would admittedly be a bold choice for a visual novel. Indeed, Phoenix Wright is our vehicle, as we experience him in both the first and the third person through the investigation and the court phases. In this first entry, Phoenix Wright is wetter behind the ears than Dumbo at a car wash, effectively mirroring any first-time player's naivety navigating its utterly bizarre court system. A court system which, in the name of efficiency, doesn't feature any kind of jury, the judge's authority being absolute most of the time, and in which every case must be solved within 3 days. As you can imagine, this puts a little bit of pressure on its participants. There's been plenty of shots aimed at the titular character of the Phoenix Wright games, calling him out as a pretty terrible lawyer, and well, it's mostly true. However, this of course gives the player a chance to figure it out for themselves, that opportunity I spoke about earlier about the game making you feel smart. Indeed, any Detective Conan enjoyers amongst you may recognise the dynamic, as to play Phoenix Wright is to undertake the role of Edogawa Conan, whilst Phoenix Wright takes up the role of Detective Kogoro Muri, the man who on the face of things solves the case, but we all know the truth. Fortunately, what Phoenix Wright occasionally lacks in critical thinking, he certainly makes up for in bluffing and general showmanship. I'll speak about the actual mechanics of the court system in the next section, but what I'll say for now is that through continually pressing for information from the various characters you'll encounter upon the witness stand, Phoenix can stall and stall and stall until at last the lies fall away, unravelling, revealing the truth. Indeed, Phoenix Wright's name in the original Japanese version of the game is Ryuichi Naruhodo, the latter word there literally meaning, I get it. This is not a series to gate its spectacular puns off to only one language. As previously stated, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney presents its own answer to the balanced scales of justice in the form of its own gameplay loop, consisting perhaps primarily of its most famous portions, the court battles, and interlaced with its counterweight, the investigation phases. We'll start by talking about those. The first investigation phase is presented early on, but not immediately into the runtime of the game. By the time you'll find yourself pottering around the Fay & Co law offices looking for clues, trying not to trip over your old boss in the process, you'll have already completed the first case in the game and exonerated Larry in a trial-only turnabout. This makes sense, as the trial sections tend to be flashy and exciting, whereas the investigation phases are slower and more cerebral. The investigation phases borrow heavily from the point-and-click genre, the only real notable difference being the lack of Phoenix himself moving around the screen, due to the fact that the investigation takes place from a first-person perspective. Notably, perhaps its biggest inspiration comes from the aforementioned Portopia Renzoku Sachujin Jiken. Within that game, selecting Investigate and then choosing the magnifying glass option brings up your cursor, magnifying glass, to start hunting for clues. Ace Attorney mimics this by bringing up your magnifying glass cursor by selecting the Examine button, ever present at the bottom of the screen, and your first option, implying its importance. Through this functionality, Phoenix Wright can gather crucial pieces of evidence to stash within his court record, acquired legitimately or not, to spring on unwitting witnesses and prodigious prosecutors at a moment's notice. witness. Whilst this may sound unfair and wildly unlike a real court system, rest assured Phoenix Wright is on the receiving end of far more legal tomfoolery than he dishes out. Mercifully, the magnifying glass will change colour once you scroll over something which can be investigated, and will even display a happy little tick over it once you've checked it once already, alleviating any chance of going around in circles. From what I remember from the 3DS version of the game, I believe this was a quality of life feature only brought in by the time that the trilogy had made its way to the Nintendo Switch generations of consoles, and was certainly a very welcome change in my house. From what I stated just now regarding the investigations perhaps being a bit slower than their flashy trial counterpart, I may have given the wrong impression. I love the investigation phases. The time taken to investigate provides each case an ample amount of breathing room and does wonders for the world building of Ace Attorney. One thing I want to applaud the game on is its copious amount of cool background art for all the various locations and environs that people keep getting murdered at. Wandering around Gaudy Lake on a crisp, cold winter's morning looking for clues is downright atmospheric. I was having a great time in my most recent playthrough until Lotta Hart showed up. Ugh. Of course, the investigation phases also provide ample opportunities to progress the story outside of the wild twists that constantly feature within the trial stages. This is where Phoenix Wright is at its most breaking and entering E, as I'm pretty sure his moonlighting as a private investigator outside of his regular lawyerly duties isn't exactly sanctioned, even within the crazy legal system of this world. This is also where you'll be spending most of your time with classic Ace Attorney characters, with the main example being the man, the myth, the legend himself, Dick Gumshoe. I love Gumshoe. He may well be my favourite character. Every initial investigation phase in each Ace Attorney's cases usually involves becoming a creative exercise in extracting far more information of the crime scene than you're legally entitled to, courtesy of Gumshoe. The primary piece of evidence he'll provide you is the autopsy report, which is definitely 100% accurate 100% of the time. Definitely. Indeed, within the investigation phases they are themselves divided up loosely into two intertwined intermingling sections, namely speaking to clients and witnesses, as well as then whipping out your own magnifying glass, Portopia style, to do some good old fashioned and definitely above board sleuthing of your own. In regards to speaking to the witnesses, it's fairly straightforward in this first entry and functions largely like the court sections, in the sense that you'll want to extract as much information out of them up front as you possibly can, before returning later on once the plot has moved forward a beat or two to squeeze out just a little bit more, usually by presenting them with an appropriate piece of new evidence or two. There may be the odd occasion where you reach something of a dead end, where you think you've found everything you can and talk to everyone about life, the universe and everything, and yet nothing is happening. Seasoned and based Ace Attorney enjoyers will always sigh with relief when jumping to a new location and being presented with the establishing text box of the location and the time, as that always means something new is about to happen. Of course, once you're done with your snooping for the day, that's when your investigation is brought to a close and when the truly high-octane, white-knuckle portions of Ace Attorney come back around. Oh yeah, we're talking about the trial sections. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney's trials are some of the most riveting stretches of video game literature that I've ever encountered. You get invested in these things. I had initially planned for the gameplay and presentation sections of this Having a Mosey review to be two separate chapters, as I've usually done previously, but they're simply so inseparable in a game like Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney that they need to be talked about together. For now, I'm going to start with the music. As always, a lot of the soundtrack in this video has been infused with the Ace Attorney OST, so in a vacuum, you'll already be able to tell they're straight up rules. However, the way that it's integrated with the gameplay in these trial sections is genius, particularly when it comes to breaking down a particularly shady or unhelpful witness, seeing past their lies and grasping the truth. Odds are you'll be vibing along to the cross-reference or the cornered music whilst cycling through the various witness statements looking for their error, their lie, their contradiction. Once you've pressed enough and found it, presenting them with a key piece of decisive evidence, the music stops, even if only for a moment. The silence here hits harder than the music itself, allowing a second, a breath, for the revelation of the moment to sink in before the tunes rally themselves once more and come back harder than ever. Similarly, landing a particularly devastating argument or counter-argument against a witness or a prosecutor is satisfying due to the game's clever use of sound effects. It is only in Phoenix Wright where rattling off a devastating argument can cause your opponent to almost literally take damage. Objection! Obviously, not every moment of the trial will be quite so rip-roaring. Usually, each day of a trial begins with your playing, rather appropriately, defense. However, once you've proved beyond reasonable doubt that your client is innocent, Phoenix Wright tends to take things one step further, as the roles almost switch, as Phoenix effectively starts to prosecute the actually guilty party on the witness stand, leading to some incredible, if legally dubious, showdowns. What makes these showdowns so satisfying, besides how so completely and utterly each villain of the piece breaks down, is how much nitpicking and calling out of falsehoods you'll have done up to this point, pulling at one thread at a time until eventually the murderer's web of lies unravels and the truth emerges. One point I will make against the game, however, is that the trials have a lives system, in which making so many mistakes, like presenting the wrong argument or asking the wrong questions at the wrong time, will cause you to eventually game over and automatically assign your client a guilty verdict. I get this needs to happen in some shape or form, it being a video game and everything, but there's definitely been occasions where it's so clearly obvious at that point that my client isn't guilty and that guy over there is, but because I said the one wrong thing, suddenly just snaps back to my guy, and that's just not fair, man. Whilst I'm over here discussing the presentation as well though, I do have to call out perhaps the biggest contradiction of all when it comes to the Phoenix Wright games, and it only really applies to its Western releases. I'm talking about the notion that Ace Attorney is supposedly set in the United States of America, or California to be exact. At best, Ace Attorney either takes place in the same world as Big Hero 6 does, or what's far more likely is that it's literally just Japan. Like, it's so clearly, definitively, most assuredly Japan. Perhaps they just wanted to make it appear to be in the States to make it a bit more marketable in the West when they originally launched it on the DS, but it has literally no real impact on the story whatsoever, so they may as well just come clean with its true location during one of the many re-releases. But there we are. Of course, this brave new Americanese world is all well and good, but what about the cases in it? Let's take a look. As always, being the penultimate section of the review, here come the spoilers, as I'll be doing a rudimentary retelling of each case in the game, focused on broad strokes and key moments over the specific minutiae, coupled with my own thought as to how they stand as actual murder mysteries. Needless to say, if you have yet to play Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney and want to keep the who in whodunit a surprise, perhaps this is the best time for you to go ahead and skip to the bottom line for my final thoughts. Beginning at the beginning, traditionally a very good place to start, we have the appropriately named The First Turnabout. Due to the incredibly short and basic nature of this case, I've largely already covered it in earlier sections of this review, but to recap slightly, the game opens in the immediate aftermath of a murder most foul. Frank Sowett, a newspaper salesman, has gone and murdered Cindy Stone by bashing her over the head with a miniature statue of the Thinker. This statue was a gift from Cindy Stone's recent boyfriend, Larry Butts, who apparently managed to scrounge together enough competence to actually A, make it himself, as well as B, adding a functional clockwork mechanism in there which announces the time when you tilt the statue's head. Larry is the kind of guy who keeps showing up in various odd jobs over the course of the series, but if he actually focused himself on his clearly master builder level tinkering skills, he'd probably make himself a killing, and not the murdery kind. As I said before, this case is very open and shut. Sowett whapped Cinderblock over the head, tries to blame it on Larry, and it's up to Phoenix and you to prove both Larry's innocence and apparently Sowett's guilt. As you can imagine, this is fairly easily done, as you'll go into this case clear-eyed, the truth presented to you immediately, with Phoenix's combined lack of experience and ignorance being the main challenge to overcome, because it's certainly not the damp squib of a prosecutor on the other side of the aisle. In fact, the only major hurdle that could really threaten to derail you, besides Larry being, well, Larry, is when Sowett calls into question the idea that there's no way to prove a specific circumstance being true on the actual day of the murder. You've already cornered Sowett at this point. His insistence on hearing the incorrect time during a blackout, the source of which he could only have heard from committing the crime himself, bringing the statue down upon Cindy's head and causing the Thinker to announce the time erroneously, provides an almost bulletproof case against him. However, he rallies one more time under the defense that there's no way to prove the clock was wrong on the day of the murder. This is where time zones come into play, and perhaps may well be the only occasion where the alleged location of California becomes relevant. Cindy had recently been overseas to France, taking the clock with her and setting it appropriately, before failing to after coming back and getting murdered. Swords Last Hurrah with this little hurdle elevates this case beyond just a cookie cutter tutorial, as it introduces the idea that even though you think you've got someone on the ropes, they've usually got at least one trick left in their back pocket. Turnabout Sisters basically takes the initial concept of the first case and expands upon it, being a pretty direct sequel down to the exact same type of murder with the exact same murder weapon. This time, Mia Fey, your mentor, has been murdered, and once again Ace Attorney is nice enough to reveal to you exactly who did it right away, Red White of Blue Corp, presumably because once again they're introducing a whole new mode of play for you, the investigation phase. Phoenix will be pottering around investigating and trialing for at least a day or two before the murderer even comes into play. Initially, you'll spend your time attempting to defend Mia's younger sister Maya Fey, the spirit medium in training. These early days of the case is also where you're introduced to perhaps just how utterly bonkers the Ace Attorney court system is. As previously mentioned, you'll consult Gumshoe early on to try and extract whatever information you can. He'll give you an autopsy report, and you'll go about your merry way, convincing Maya Fey to hire you, finding further clues, and questioning further witnesses. What you won't know, what Phoenix doesn't know, heck, what Gumshoe doesn't know, is that he's just handed you a ticking time bomb. A time bomb triggered later in court, detonating all over your argument and devastating your case. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, voiced through the freshly introduced Miles Edgeworth, introduces the idea of the outdated autopsy report. Not only is this sprung on you literally in the moment, flying in the face of any logical evidence law, the court just kind of takes this revelation and runs with it, forcing you to pick up the pieces later. Otherwise, being only case 2 and with the real murderer still apparent, Turnabout Sisters remains fairly straightforward, though does raise the stakes by switching the defendant from Maya Fey to yourself, Phoenix Wright, halfway through. Between this and the notion of the entire legal system being in the murderer's pocket, it's more than enough to get any first-time Ace Attorney experience's blood pumping. On to case 3 and the decisive evidence that this game is most definitely set in Japan, we have Turnabout Samurai. This is the very first case in the series which doesn't immediately present to the player whodunit, making it perhaps the first real Honkaku story in the Ace Attorney canon. It's also the first story where you're thoroughly removed from the actual defendant, being not your childhood best friend, your former's mentor kid sister, or yourself. Instead, you're defending masked superstar Will Powers, the Steel Samurai himself, alleged to have killed his co-star and fictional nemesis, Jack Hammer. Hammer is found impaled in Studio 1 of Global Studios with a wound that looks suspiciously like the work of the Steel Samurai's signature spear. So in this convict first and don't bother asking questions later world of Ace Attorney, naturally suspicion immediately falls upon Will Powers, perpetuated by almost everyone at the studios, overtly by terrifying Obertarian Wendy Oldbag, and covertly by the powers that be, the director and the producer. It takes a little while for these latter two characters to be revealed, which is by design, seeing as the producer is sort of technically the closest to the one what did it. Before we get to that though, a particularly stand-up moment of this case comes during one of its investigation phases where you'll be pressing the producer harder than she's clearly comfortable with. With links to the local mafia, or Yakuza, she summons her boys to ensure that you'll never work in this town again, she? Just when all seems lost, Gumshoe bursts into the room and saves the day, providing his hero moment and elevating him from bumbling dick to, well, a bumbling dick with a heart of gold. It is at this point I should reveal that the murder of Jack Hammer was neither premeditated nor even a murder, more a straight up accidental suicide. Whilst looking to confront the producer, De Vasquez, over an ongoing issue of blackmail, he stumbles and impales himself upon a nearby fence, which is coincidentally exactly how one of Hammer's co-stars had died several years before, the subject of which had then enabled Vasquez to effectively blackmail Hammer ever since. The second major event of note in this case comes during an instance of when Phoenix is questioning Vasquez after she's taken the stand. In the previous case, Edgeworth seemed to be pursuing his guilty verdict against Phoenix almost with some kind of bloodlust, yet here something seems to twig within him and he realises that Vasquez herself clearly has something to do with Hammer's untimely demise. Basically, Edgeworth starts helping you, prosecuting or trying to prosecute Vasquez right along with Phoenix. This is very much something of a turning point for Edgeworth, which is expanded upon more in the next case. I'm largely of the opinion that each case in the first game basically gets better and better, with Turnabout Samurai not bucking this trend. I think it was a bold and very cool choice that the first real murder mystery of the game isn't actually, technically speaking, a murder. This case does a very good job of throwing you off the scent, what with the location of death being switched, and with almost every witness seemingly able to throw Will Powers under the bus. The idea of the steel samurai costume itself being implemented into the method of execution is also a very nice touch. Now we come upon Turnabout Goodbyes, the first real finale of Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, as the game only originally launched with 4 cases back on the Game Boy Advance in 2001. This is the case that basically ties everything from the previous 4 cases together and concludes the first game's overarching story. This time we find Edgeworth in the defendant's chair, accused of taking former lawyer Robert Hammond on a boat trip out of the lake before shooting him dead. I also want to point out that of the 4 cases in the game, 3 of them have defendants directly tied to Phoenix in some shape or form. I never really put it together before, but in terms of the numbers as being laid out there, wow. Kinda lends a lot of credence towards my theory of the power of friendship being the main focus of this story, if I do say so myself. Regardless, this is a longer case than the previous one, but somewhat more focused, introducing less characters and only having 2 real witnesses, namely Lotta Hart and Yanni Yogi. I'm actually going to go off on a bit of a tangent here as to why I really dislike Lotta Hart. Pretty much every other witness in this game lies for some kind of self-serving reason that largely makes sense in the form of self-preservation, whether they're covering for the murderer or straight up did the murdering themselves. Lotta Hart openly admits later that the only reason she babbles in her rambling nonsense and produces allegedly decisive evidence in the form of incredibly blurry photographs is literally just so she can roleplay as some kind of star witness, and this is kind of just shrugged off. Needless to say, I had quite the jump scare when she appeared in Ace Attorney Justice for All. If I wanted to get that upset when engaging in a video game sequel, then I would literally just play Jak 2. Regardless, this case also reintroduces Larry, whose bumbling antics somehow end up being quite central to its resolution, one of the gunshots being his ill-fated attempts to pump up the giant steel samurai inflatable thing he's got going on. I mentioned Yanni Yogi earlier, and strictly speaking, he's the murderer. In an attempt to get revenge on Edgeworth's father, Gregory Edgeworth, the man he blamed for ruining his life, Yanni Yogi stages a fake murder by dressing up as Robert Hammond and pretending to shoot himself in front of Edgeworth before, of course, straight up murdering Robert Hammond himself. This is because Yanni Yogi had been accused of murdering Gregory Edgeworth 15 years prior in the DL6 incident, and to prove it, the police had consulted Misty Faye, mother to Mia and Maya and full-fledged spirit medium. Gregory from the grave had mistakenly implicated Yanni Yogi as the killer, yet Robert Hammond, the defense attorney, pleaded innocent based on a temporary insanity, getting Yanni Yogi acquitted but at the cost of his life as he knew it. By the way, you basically unravel all of this by cross-examining Yanni Yogi's parrot, being perhaps one of the most novel witnesses in the trilogy, if not the whole series. However, once you've successfully proven Edgeworth's innocence in this case, Edgeworth won't have any of that and attempts to throw himself under the bus again by implicating himself in his own father's murder, claiming to have accidentally killed him during that DL6 incident. You may have noticed I've not actually mentioned the prosecutor of this case yet, seeing as Edgeworth is in the stand, and if it were paying, this would have been over in about 5 minutes. The prosecutor in this 4th case is the Dickensian villain-esque Manfred von Karma, Edgeworth's mentor and definite bad egg. Despite having taken Edgeworth in following the death of his father, von Karma pursues Edgeworth's guilty verdict with an alarming determination over the course of this case, taking over the proceedings of the court on multiple occasions in the process. He seems to positively salivate when Edgeworth offers himself up on a silver platter. Naturally, it's because von Karma is none other than the actual murderer in the DL6 incident and had orchestrated the murder of Roger Hammond with Yanni Yogi as his living murder weapon. Eventually, von Karma is brought down and the day is won. Wow, that was a lot of exposition. This case has layers, man. It's definitely the strongest case in the game as it ties literally everything up in a neat little bow. Maya disappears off to the countryside to hone her spirit channeling, Edgeworth the Tin Man shows signs of growing a heart, and Phoenix carries on lawyering away for the foreseeable. Or that's how it was before the DS port. Okay, if I try and go too in depth into this final case, this video will end up going on way too long, so I really will just lightly brush over it this time. This final case, the bonus case, Rise from the Ashes, is initially notable for being the only case in the game, heck the trilogy, heck the series, which doesn't incorporate the word turnabout in its title somewhere. despite being presented as part of the core game, it's still pretty clearly a bonus case. Maya is still nowhere to be seen, probably off playing Jumanji somewhere, replaced instead by Emma Skye, about as attuned with the supernatural as a baked potato. Instead, she introduces a lot of conspicuously stylus control-coded forensic mechanics, which I thoroughly enjoyed and feel are right at home in a game like Phoenix Wright. However, due to being so retrofitted into this first entry, a lot of these mechanics will subsequently disappear for the remainder of the trilogy, only to reappear once again in Ace Attorney 4, Apollo Justice. It may sound like I'm having a bit of a moan about this case being out of place or something, and I promise I'm not. I actually love it. About the only negative thing I say about this case is that I think it goes on for a bit too long. Having said that, it has the most compelling method of murder in the whole game, in which the same murder is somehow committed twice, simultaneously, in two entirely separate locations. Add on to this a client who seems completely and utterly heck-bent on getting themselves convicted, and it leads to a real head-scratcher. This case has got a lot of one-off characters due to the nature of its effectively being a bonus turnabout, but it's also a great excuse to hang out with Edgeworth and Gumshoe some more. I'm actually not going to spoil this one in the event you're powering through this section despite having not played the game, because some secrets deserve to be experienced organically, and also talking about the culprit would once again open a can of worms at least a further 2,000 words long. To wrap this up, once you get past the tutorial case of 1 and the basically extended tutorial case of 2, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney offers 3 solid, compelling murder mysteries, and then 2 fun exercises in pulling the wool off of Phoenix Wright's eyes to collar, saw it, and red white. With that said, let's bring this trial of Ace Attorney to a close. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney is the natural and logical progression and wonderful realization of the Honkaku genre turned interactive. I would go so far as to pronounce Ace Attorney guilty of murdering my free time on many, many counts. Ace Attorney was largely my first exposure to the visual novel genre, and honestly it's been rather difficult to find anything that tops it. The natural progression beyond its many sequels and spin-offs is probably Danganronpa, although that's perhaps a story for another day. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney is a video game in which you call out contradictions. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney is a video game which makes you feel triumphant and flummoxed in equal measure. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney is literature in video game form. Not only is it a solid start into its own series or the visual novel medium, it's also a fitting entry point into the Honkaku genre if you fancy some additional reading. On that point, at an earlier point in this review, I mentioned I was currently reading Tokyo Express by Seiichi Matsumoto. Due to just how long the production cycles on these have been recently, I've actually read several more books since I wrote and recorded that part of the video, and honestly it's a genre of reading that begs exploration if you guys enjoy a good murder mystery. I'd personally suggest The Decagon House Murders by Yukito Ayatsuji as a great jumping in point. On the topic of lengthy production cycles for these videos, I promise I'm going to try and tighten them up again. Time was I could knock 3 of these out in 2 months, whereas now I've done 3 over the last 2 years. Call it a combination of going to a full-time job, life events, and my ongoing tendency of letting perfect be the enemy of good. Also, I bought a Steam Deck. I've been tinkering and playing with that pretty much non-stop for the better part of the year. I reckon if I work on those last 2 points I can get at least one of these out a bit more frequently than before and get the ball truly rolling on having a Mosey Season 3. Whilst I'm here, I also want to give 2 quick shout outs, namely to Forever Driven and Water Surf. Both of these fine fellas have given me and my Road Trip Adventure video a nod in 2 of their recent works on the game, so here I am returning the favour. You should totally go and check this stuff out. Go support your local internet Road Trip adventurers, man. That game rules, and Road Trip Adventure enjoyers rule too. With all that said, please do consider joining me next time when I'll be talking about a different game. Rounding up the trilogy that basically started it all for the Having a Mosey series, we'll be returning once more to the medieval realm of Alefgard, though whilst taking an awful lot of extra, shiny HD 2D stops along the way.